So that's why when people say academicians are not good entrepreneurs or they can't create businesses, it drives me really mad because we have been trained to run into walls and find ways around it, especially engineering ones. We're kind of more creative in maybe finding solutions.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Woo!
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Eric Hornung, and I'm accompanied by Mr. Claymation enthusiast himself, Jay Klaus. Jay, how's it going, man?
I like claymation. What's that old claymation movie, Wallace and Gromit? Is that kind of the beginning of claymation?
I don't know if that's the beginning of claymation, but maybe that's your first memory of claymation.
I feel like it's the beginning of claymation in modern like pop culture. And then what was the one about chickens?
What about Gumby? Gumby was claymation.
That's true. Gumby might have been earlier.
Gumby definitely came before Wallace and Gromit.
Yeah, Gumby's old. Was Gumby on cable though? Because I didn't have cable.
I don't know, but I watched a lot of Gumby growing up, and I know that because I don't remember any of the Gumby shows. If I saw one, I would have no idea, but I do remember that I had these Gumby action figures, and I had them everywhere. I had so many of them, especially the blockhead guys.
Today's nickname, Potshot, comes from a conversation in Slack, where Eric and I were talking about how our brains work, and this was the lash out that I got.
Yeah, I was being a little confrontational, that's for sure. I was delayed. So I was flying back from Puerto Rico, and I was supposed to be getting back into Cincinnati around 10:30 p.m. I didn't end up getting in until around 2:30 a.m. So I was a little confrontational, and I know that Jay has a habit of watching weird videos on YouTube. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
That's
or
fair.
Instagram.
It's not. It's kind of all over the place. I mean, here's the deal. I really like to see what other creators are creating, and I like it to be really far outside of what I'm doing. So I subscribe to a newsletter called Motionographer, which is all about motion graphics creations. My Instagram feed is probably a lot different than most people's. It has zero memes, but all kinds of weird creation and art. And some of that stuff is deeply unsettling, and I'll send it to friends like Eric.
So I, in a very derogatory fashion, called his little hobby claymation. And that's how we got to today's nickname.
You call it a hobby. I call it what keeps me sharp and what keeps me creative.
It's funny that you call it sharp because I feel like so much of what you watch is just people moving in a very fluid fashion. I think you showed me 8 videos in a row once of this guy who just wiggles around.
I don't remember that, but I don't dispute it whatsoever. Oh, well, I mean, what's your Instagram feed like?
I don't know. I haven't been on Instagram in 5 months.
All right. Well, that's the best answer you could have had.
That's pretty good, huh?
Really shuts me up. Well, let's just dive into today's guest, shall we? Today's guest is Esra Roan, the co-founder and CEO of SOMAVAC Medical Solutions. SOMAVAC was referred to us by our friend Katie Milligan at StartCo. SOMAVAC is a medical device company with a mission to change how patients recover after major surgeries. Its first FDA-cleared product, the SOMAVAC 100 sustained vacuum device, addresses seroma and hematoma formation with the first continuous suction device. Basically, this device is replacing very old technology that is used to remove fluid buildup post-surgery, and that old technology to remove fluids is really just a plastic bulb that is attached by a hose into the area where fluid is built up.
I don't have a problem with seeing blood or seeing surgeries on TV like some people do, but I just have zero exposure to medicine. Medicine, surgery, I don't get it. I don't understand how the system works. I don't understand the processes and procedures. You're saying a plastic bulb with fluids, and I have no idea how this all fits together.
Have you ever seen the small handheld bulbs that remove boogers for babies?
I have no idea what that is.
It's kind of like a hand pump You've probably seen a pump for something.
Like a basketball?
Maybe. It's not like the two-handed push down on the thing pump, but if it is just like a plastic or rubber bulb, that is similar. Basically, these pumps, they push air out, and when they recontract, they pull air in, and that is the suction that you get. So for babies, they use that to pull boogers out of their nose because their noses are so small that you can't use anything else. In this example, these bulbs are attached to a hose, which are literally pushed into incisions where surgery had taken place because fluid is building up post-surgery. And so the person who is post-surgery is pumping that bulb whenever they feel like they need to remove that fluid. And it seems like historically that can be for a period of several weeks for these individuals. So the SOMAVAC device fits in somebody's belt and is continuously electronically suctioning that area, which they say leads to faster healing, a better experience, and a much more discreet way to provide dignity to the person who is removing that fluid.
Interesting. Well, I'll definitely be interested to hear about that because I had no idea that baby booger bulbs were even a thing, let alone like fluid post-op treatments. So I think that this is going to be a interview that I learn a ton in.
Yeah. A little bit more context here. SOMAVAC was founded in 2016. It's based in Memphis, Tennessee. I did a little bit of research on the medical device market and found that medical device investment has grown every year since 2013, which is the furthest year back I could find on CB Insights. And last year, actually 2017, over $6 billion were invested in medical device companies.
Are you ready to jump in, Jay?
Let's do it.
Hey guys, wanted to cut in here real quick and let you know about something Jay and I have been getting ready behind the scenes in 2019. When we started this podcast, Jay and I said that you, the listener, would have an opportunity to learn in real time, to think like venture investors with us as we meet a wide variety of personalities and examine a wide range of industries. Well, now we're going to share something new, and it's a little different. This new idea is called The Update. It's a carefully curated quarterly publication of editorials, trends, and stories happening outside of Silicon Valley. Jay and I will be writing stories about what we're learning about on the podcast, have guest editorials on interesting topics, and share news and updates from our podcasts. In some cases, we may even share some exclusive content or first looks. Our goal is to stay at the cutting edge, and of course, bring you along with us. We're super excited about it and know you're going to love it. If you want to be the first to hear about our Q1 launch and subsequent letters, go to upside.fm/update to get on the mailing list.
And before we get into that interview with Esra, we brought in Dr. Mark Gay, who practices otolaryngology with University Hospitals as an ear, nose, and throat doctor, serving the community of Sheffield Village, Ohio. Dr. Gay received his medical degree from Loyola University Chicago and is certified by the American Board of Otolaryngology. He completed his internship in general surgery at Loyola University Medical Center and a residency at Cleveland Clinic. So before we jump in with Esra, please enjoy this short interview with Dr. Mark Gay. Dr. Gay, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Can you explain your current role?
I'm a board-certified ENT or ear, nose, and throat surgeon out of Cleveland.
We have a guest today who has a device that addresses seroma. So for our listeners, could you explain what seroma is?
So seroma is basically a collection of fluid that doesn't have red blood cells. So if you take blood and you stick yourself with a pin, you prick yourself, you extract blood. Blood itself has red blood cells that make it red in color, and the base fluid, which is not the red blood cells, that is the remaining part of blood, is actually serous fluid, S-E-R-O-U-S. So serous fluid will collect at the site of a wound, whether it's surgical or otherwise. If the serous fluid collects and the body does not reabsorb it, that fluid remains behind, and depending on what the cells are doing, they may continue to weep into this collection of fluid. We call that a seroma. So anytime you have damaged tissue, if I hit my hand hard enough, it won't bleed, but the cells underneath will break, and when the cells break, you'll collect that fluid within the tissues. If that fluid does not get reabsorbed by the body, and it stays behind long enough, it collects into seroma. And it can get what we call loculated. Loculated almost akin to a balloon. If I put a balloon into your skin underneath and blew it up with fluid, it would be akin to that sort of process. So the key with a seroma is, to the best of the surgeon's ability, is to get it to drain. And if you allow the fluid to drain or keep decompressed, the remaining tissues in the body will heal and close off that void or that space so that fluid doesn't have a chance to collect again.
I see. So what would lead to the body not reabsorbing this?
So sometimes it's the amount of injury to the tissue itself. The best way to explain it is the body is composed of sheets. So when I talk to patients in the office, we talk about your bed at home. So your bed at home has typically a mattress pad. It'll have a flat or a fitted sheet. That's the one that goes around your mattress. It'll have a flat sheet, and then you'll have a blanket. Then you'll have a comforter and maybe a bedspread. All those different layers. Imagine if you collected, and they were all water insoluble, if you collected a fluid collection between those layers, that's what occurs. Ordinarily, the body will reabsorb, but sometimes, based on surgery, based on change of those tissue planes, you don't have the capacity to reabsorb that fluid as easily, and so you form a seroma.
And it sounds like the body is actually at a advantage or better able to handle that fluid buildup or prevent a seroma if the sheets are kept close together?
Correct.
Got it. So what percentage of patients that go through surgery are going to experience something like this or may experience something like this?
So in ENT, if you're talking specifically about neck surgery, thyroid, parathyroid, salivary gland, neck dissections for cancer, et cetera, the incidence is actually pretty low. The good news in ENT is that it has a tremendous blood supply, and because of that, it has a much greater capacity to heal than a lot of other parts of the body. So for ENT, the incidence of seroma formation is probably less than 3%. If you go to other parts of the body in the abdomen where there's a much greater cavity, so to speak, a space for fluid to accumulate, that incidence can be significantly higher. Since I'm not an abdominal or general surgeon, I couldn't tell you that for sure. Breast surgery, you can have seromas form. Plastic surgery, when you separate those sheets and you don't have a capacity to reabsorb the fluid, you can form a seroma. So it's not a high probability of occurring. The problem becomes when it does occur, it's a significant issue to get it rectified, because now you have fluid accumulated in literally a dead space, and things tend to get infected depending on what that space is and what organisms can get in there to have an impact on producing not just a seroma, but convert that into an abscess.
You mentioned that it's the surgeon's role then to try and drain that. How does the surgeon do that? Does it apply to the patient, post-op when they're in their home? What's the drainage process look like?
So a lot, depending on how much fluid aggregates or accumulates, sometimes we actually do nothing at all. If it's a large fluid collection, a lot of times you'll take the patients back to surgery and you will make a small incision in drainage, drain out that fluid. And then the next key, as you said adequately, is how do you get the sheets back together so they re-aggregate and shut off that dead space. And so sometimes I do put a suction drain in. Other times we just use compression, literally put a very snug dressing around it. We won't use a suction drain, but we'll use what we call a Penrose, almost akin to a rubber band, where that will allow the fluid to drain. And while you're applying pressure, it'll allow the layers to fuse back together, obliterate the dead space, and get the patient back to their normal state.
What does a suction drain look like?
So there are various types, and I use what we call a grenade suction drain. It's a drain that has perforations in it that's inside the patient, and then outside the patient is completely closed off, otherwise it would suck air. And that hooks to a device that produces basically a constant suction. Low suction, not very high in terms of negative pressure, but sufficiently enough that it will reabsorb the fluid and not allow it to aggregate or stick around. So the perforations are there, fluid goes in through the perforations, and for me, I use what we call a grenade. You literally squeeze the grenade, you put the cap back on, and as the grenade is expanding, it's sucking the fluid out simultaneously. And the patients at home will typically empty that 2 to 3 times a day, and I'll see them back a couple, 3 days later, make sure they're doing well. If they're doing really well, take the drain out, and they're on their way.
Great. That gives me a lot of context and insight. I appreciate your time here this morning.
My pleasure.
Esra, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me in our company. Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you as well. On Upside, we like to start with a background on the founder. So can you tell us about the history of Esra?
Oh my goodness. I don't know where to begin, but we will start. I'm originally from Istanbul, Turkey. I was born and raised there. And in 94 came to US on tennis scholarship. So I was an athlete. I played pro sports and came here to Tennessee Tech. I was supposed to go to Ohio State. Last minute plans changed and ended up at Tennessee Tech. Long story short, studied mechanical engineering there, then did some time during my master's at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. From there, I spent some time in doing optical mechanics, optomechanics, microelectromechanics. During late 90s, there was a lot of interest in high-tech industry, miniaturizing everything, making switches and so on. From there, life, husband, family takes you to Cincinnati with Toyota. So we moved there, spent some time. I got a job in Cincinnati with a manufacturing company there. I very much enjoyed some parts of it, but realized cubicle world was not for me. So from there, I decided to chase a PhD. So I started with University of Cincinnati. I'm a Bearcat as well. So I did my PhD in mechanical engineering there, but I was very much of a mechanical engineer who didn't want to do cars and airplanes. I wanted to do something. At that point, I switched over to medical questions. And of all the things, I started studying the mechanics of liver tissue. And everyone went, why? Why are you doing that? Because it doesn't move. But in so many environments, when liver gets injured, it can really be bad for you. So I spent time and graduated in 2007. And from there came to Memphis for my job. That's where work-life balance. My husband followed me to Memphis. I was tenured as professor. I got my tenure in 2015. But I realized that was not for me as well. After having gotten a tenure in biomedical engineering and NIH grants and all of that, studying basic lung health, I realized I want to do something different. And there we launched the company, SOMAVAC Medical Solutions, what we're doing currently. So long story short, I have a diverse background, multicultural, whatever you name it, just everything is in there.
Take me all the way back. That was an awesome rocket ship kind of giving us the landscape. And I know that Jay is going to ask some timeline questions about it, I would assume.
That was the most efficient 2.5 minutes through somebody's career that I've ever heard.
I told you, where do you want me to start?
I love it.
It goes even farther back. I can go, tennis years.
So I want to go back to Istanbul. And are you Turkish? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm dual citizen, so I have dual citizenship. So I'm U.S. citizen as well as Turkish.
What's it like growing up in such a kind of center of worlds city? Because
yeah.
I feel like it's been called like Lagos, Byzantium, New Rome, Constantinople, Istanbul, Istanbul. Yeah. Like it has so many names because it's been under so many different. Like what's it like today, and what's it like living in that like historical city?
It was amazing. I mean, I just have to say, first of all, being with that many people together is amazing. My high school was an Italian high school that my first learned, so Turkish, Italian, English are the three languages, right? So then Latin. So you're around, every day you wake up and you're around people, just every day you're interacting with people. When we used to skip school, we used to go to the Venetian Tower that's 500 years or something else old. You're in the midst of that, all that history. It brings two things, though. It brings a lot of thought about we are great. We have this great history of having done great things. And it stifles your forward looking a little bit. Maybe you need to iterate and start anew on some things. And I need to be, careful about how I state this. But, if you have such a heavy past in the city and you're just looking everywhere, there's greatness. Am I living up to this greatness to some extent as a person, as a country, But it was fantastic. I came here when I was 18. You can age me that way. I came from Istanbul, which is 10 million plus, right, people, to Cookeville, Tennessee. So in the early 90s, no cell phone, no credit cards. So I came to US with cash in my pocket, about $500 for a whole semester. Just started my years here, and it was just an amazing experience. I landed at Nashville Airport, And I'm thinking, where are the tall buildings that we were supposed to see when we arrived to US? So, but then I think Istanbul it makes you get used to just different things. You're very comfortable with change. You're very comfortable with meeting people. So that's what I would say.
I would love to hear a little bit more about your childhood, because I imagine your parents had a big impact on you. But as you're going through your story, you're talking, I came to America on a tennis scholarship, played some professional tennis, and then you got into mechanical engineering. And those two things seem like worlds apart to me. So I'd love to hear how those things coalesced in you.
So when I was really, really young, I was really curious in space, like planets. I was just a curious kid. And I remember looking at notebooks of space and stars and so on. And my parents used to get more of those. But really, as a Turkish female, you really did not have a big path of science and technology and careers. And, there was no thought of, oh, I'm going to go and be an engineer, or none of that. But my mother somehow started me when I was 6 in playing tennis. And I'm just really a competitive person, very competitive, and it caught. By 11, I was practicing 4 or 5 hours a day. I played Fed Cup, which is equivalent of Davis Cup for my country. Been in environments that are really kind of competitive and so on, but opportunities are different. This is early, like mid-'80s and so on. Opportunities between Turkey and Europe are different in this sort of thing. If you're going to be a tennis player, you have to get some level of investment for you to start traveling when you're 15 around the world. And we didn't do that, so I made the decision I'm coming to US. So I was actually signed up to do political science, not mechanical engineering. I didn't know that I really wanted to go into science and technology in my career until I came to Tennessee Tech and met another Turkish person and said, this school is really great in engineering, so maybe you should consider. It's that simple. Sometimes life takes you in very simple ways in directions you don't understand. But anyone who knows me, I love politics. I read all the time. So that's the topic, I thought I would be studying.
Jay, have you ever played tennis?
I've played more tennis than I've played hockey.
Okay, we're trying to expand Jay's athletic skill set. So I always got to check in to make sure, because if we have an opportunity, we already got him going alpine skiing. We got him playing golf. Well, alpine skiing in Prague, golf in Minnesota. Okay. I was hoping tennis in Turkey, but
tennis in Memphis. Come on,
tennis in Memphis.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, we visit Columbus. I was there recently in Cincinnati, so we can, The long story short is I was signed up to go to Ohio State, and last minute, there's no email, there's no cell phones. Last minute, it didn't work out, and I went to Tennessee Tech. When we're faxing and sending beta tapes. Do you know what beta tapes are? Video? Nope.
Oh,
they are shaking.
Like Betamax?
Beta tapes, or these VHS or beta.
It was
before the smaller.
Yeah, the precursor to VHS. Yeah.
Yes, precursor to VHS. We would tape those and send the US our talent, right? That we would send, and they would watch you, and if you played well enough, they would sign you on. So,
is there a large Turkish community at Tennessee Tech, or did you just happen to run into someone who was Turkish?
I happened to run. In engineering, there was. In engineering, there was one professor who presumably, we need to double check this, that designed some of the Star Wars, the smaller robot, Baji, and his student who was, but really we were 3 or 4 or something, There's not much. We coalesce around big cities. Turkish people like big cities. So, Columbus has a very strong Turkish community because of Ohio State.
So, and Eric and I are both Buckeyes, and we could probably talk about that for 20 minutes, but we won't for the listeners' sake. So tell me about the change into mechanical engineering. How did you become aware of it and say, yep, that's what I want to do?
When you make the trip from a small country like Turkey to US, and when you make the decision, okay, I'm not going to be a tennis player for life, you think about your career, your life, and things like that, and you want to insure it. And, someone who I met and respected, much older than me, said mechanical engineering, it's pretty strong at this university. I knew engineering was strong, just jumped into it. And what I found out that it was really about science. So I really enjoy science. And I really like doing things. So I think engineering, people sometimes don't realize how engineering is about, it's an art form where you have tools like you have chemistry, you have biology, you have physics, and you cook them into a dish, which is the products that we use today. So I taught many years, we forget engineering is an art form. So that caught on to me very quickly that, oh, I can make things, So that's the piece that got me. Otherwise, I was not a very good student. Even during PhD years, I tell my advisor, I'm just not that great in theory. I just like to put things together. I see how different elements come together. And I think that's what engineers are supposed to do.
First off, I love the idea of engineering as an art form. I think that's a great phrase. But then PhD equals theory in my head, and you are saying I'm not a theorist. I don't do theory, but you went PhD route. So help me understand why that was the natural progression.
Do you want the honest answer or the calculated answer?
Definitely the honest answer.
Yes, I sense that. So I was working full time, and in Cincinnati, the company I worked for, where I started, 1,500 people, was going down in numbers. I survived 2 layoffs, and I was in cubicles with a master's degree. I was doing really fun things, but I could see the writing in the wall, plus the cubicle, not having decision making. That's what that one indicates to me more than anything. So what happened was my husband and I were talking about having family as well. The perfect storm came together and said, why don't, and I wasn't getting fulfilled with day-to-day activities as an engineer, what I was doing. I was wanting to have an impact. So a couple of things coming together. I said, why don't I go for PhD? Because after that I could teach, I could be an academic, I could be at the university. Maybe that puts me more in touch with people and I can have an impact in there, So that's why I went back to PhD. I struggled because I was pregnant. I had my son. Do you know about the fundamentals exam, the big exam you take in PhD, at the end of first year?
I don't.
It's a do or die kind of. You have to go through this gate to stay in. So mine was a couple of days before my due date. So I ended up having my son during that night. So it was all I was the pregnant lady walking in the mechanical engineering, hallways. But everyone was extremely kind. My advisor was a really, really good mathematician, came from UT Austin a couple of years before I arrived there. He was looking, I think, for an applied person. So we kind of matched really perfectly. I said, he gave me his papers, right, as an introduction to his work. I said, no, these are so theoretical. I can't do that because I like finite element analysis, a tool that really helps you to analyze things. And he said, okay, what can you do? So I went around and I looked and I said, why can't I apply what you got here into something in the medical sciences? And he's like, fine. So we worked that way. So creativity. So PhD is about doing something that's not been done before and running into a wall and solving. My definition when I had students, the way I describe PhD is you run into a wall. You feel like there's no answer to the question you're after, and you find a way to get through that. So that's my definition of PhD. If you don't have that helplessness, it's not a PhD. So that's what you can get to that in different ways. It's Doctor of Philosophy.
That also sounds like the definition of entrepreneurship to me.
Exactly. So that's why when people say academicians are not good entrepreneurs or they can't create businesses, it drives me really mad because we have been trained to run into walls and find ways around it, especially engineering ones. We're kind of more creative in maybe finding solutions. I wouldn't want to, claim generically, but that's what definition of PhD is. You got to do something that's never been done before, and you got to get through a gate where you really say, I can't do this, and you do it.
I hear a thread in your history of curiosity and creativity. Was entrepreneurship a part of that all the way through?
No.
Or
Zero.
when did
Zero.
entrepreneurship take hold for you?
It was when I decided to leave academia, which was the year I got my tenure. I had thoughts about this is not for me. Grant writing, doing things in this big grand scheme, it was not a good fit for me. And I didn't think that I would be a good worker for my university at that point for 30 more years, right? Because you have a job now. You made it, you have grants, So at that time, I realized there were lots of changes in me, and right around 40, midlife adjustment, not crisis, I call it. It's just an adjustment that I think we get to look back and say, here's what I did, here's what 30 more years of work is going to look like me. Do I want it? So I had the flexibility. My husband said, do what you want. Like, really, he was very much at that point. The thing that came into view is Josh, my co-founder, was an excellent student of mine. And we have these accelerators in town, and I normally send them to my students. And then somehow, months later, we say, let's apply on this together because we work well together. I still didn't know that I would be a business owner or entrepreneur. Still didn't know. It came to my view that I may be decent at it or I may want to do it is 2017, I would say. I came to own that, wow. And if I look back as a Turkish, as someone who's traveled alone, as someone who's just been always tennis player, competitive, all these things, if you put the story together in hindsight, it makes sense. But me owning it is 2017.
What was so captivating about Josh as a student and his idea? I'm guessing that this idea that he had that went to the accelerator is what became SOMAVAC, or am I projecting?
So you are a little bit, but it's somewhat, So Josh, I recruited him for my husband is from Tennessee Tech Mechanical Engineering. I am from Tennessee Tech Mechanical Engineering, and Josh is. And I recruited him about 4 years ago or so from there to come and work in my lab to do some of the things we had NIH funding for. Because I needed someone who was really solid in making things. So we worked for 2 years very well together. So we had that track record of knowing how to do things. And when time came that we should, this is really crazy, but when time came to apply to the accelerator, we said, what's a big problem in this healthcare field that the two of us could solve? That's the way it started. So we both created. He's really more of the engineer, hands-on, and he tinkers and gets things put together beautifully. And, but I'm maybe more the clinical science side of, the team. But the two of us just kind of went there, and then we met with surgeons and went back and forth very quickly. Really, the idea came out of 10 hours of back and forth once we received that first investment through the 0510 accelerator here in town, which was $50,000. I can share that with you. That's the way we realized, okay, now we have a company to do this. So that's how it evolved, basically.
Is the 0510 accelerator part of StartCo?
No, it's BioWorks. BioWorks Foundation runs 0510, but it takes place under StartCo's physical space. And we share them equally. We share our ecosystem here. That's Memphis. We have StartCo, we have BioWorks, we have 0510, we have Epicenter. We share them equally. We don't, they help us in all ways.
And so what was the problem that you and Josh submitted to the accelerator that you were solving? How did you state it then?
It was these two surgeons that I know really well that I work with in certain topics separate than this, we asked them, what is one problem you want solved? So seroma. So after these mastectomies, hernia repairs, anytime there's a resection out of the tissue for purposes of oncology or a variety of reasons, you leave a large space that's empty, and that space will naturally produce fluid. So if this fluid then has to be removed, over time, like weeks time frame after the surgery, the surgeons place a drain in the tissue to evacuate and attach what's called a suction bulb to it, manual suction bulb. What we learned is that the buildup of fluid, that's seroma, happens very often. Approximately 1 in 5 patients of, generic everyone, if I were to estimate, 1 in 5 people go on to have where seroma builds up, it's painful, they have to go back to the clinic, they have to get an aspiration, like in, another puncture has to happen and fluid has to draw out. Maybe resurgery happens. So all of these things, when we looked at it and we looked at this thing, the handheld manual pump, we're like, it's not suctioning well. This is not doing anything. It runs out of suction and it's much hated by patients. So we created SOMAVAC sustained vacuum system that's first and foremost meant to suction fluids out very effectively. It's battery operated, so it's no more manual. So we're not going to rely on patients charging and emptying. So then it's wearable. It fits under the clothing pretty discreetly. So patients can really not hate these things and maybe go on with their lives. Because we met people who had hernia repairs that need to go back to work 2 weeks out and still couldn't because they had drains on and all of these things. So that's what we launched. Basically, through those conversations, we iterated multiple times. We started with different versions. One side, having really close contacts with renowned surgeons. Plus, I had good understanding of the clinical and science side of it, and Josh being a fantastic engineer, and us having worked together before just went very quickly, from there.
So can we walk a little bit deeper into the design process? Like, how did the first design look versus the design that is currently being put forward?
Oh, it is very interesting that if I showed you the pictures of our first design, we're very similar to it, but we deviated in the middle from it because, for example, patients might get 4 drains at times or 6 drains. One patient might get 6 drains. If you have double mastectomy, this is a very special problem for breast cancer patients. If you have mastectomy with reconstruction and autologous tissue use, you might end up with 5 or 6 drains. So we designed a version where it had straight out capacity to accept all of those, but then it got bulky and big and all of those things. And we're like, well, we are now getting away from our goal to make it easy to use. So, and again, this is where MVP, right? The whole conversation about you have to start somewhere, you have to stop the design somewhere. So after iterations back and forth between patients and surgeons, so we feel very fortunate that we're bridging that divide, maybe gap between patients and surgeons. So many people have surgeries, but then recover at home. Most of the recovery takes home, and yet the devices are not designed for them. So that's where the iterations took place, where we would hear one thing from one side and take it back to surgeons, and they would say, no, we can't have that. Go back to the patients. And we just iterated back and forth. So that took some time.
What is incrementally better about the SOMAVAC product as opposed to these traditional suction balls? Is it just using a little bit better technology and it's more wearable, or like what is the step up here?
Number 1, robust, reliable suction. Currently, the bulb runs out of suction with 20 ml. So patients are getting hundreds of mLs of fluid a day. If I told you that it only suctions for 20 ml, so the container is 100 ml, it's suctioning only for about 20 ml. So 1/5 of that, right, is active. So if I told you your active ingredient is very, very small amount of something you're buying, right, you'd be okay, So what we're making is literally the active part is more sustainable, right? So it's battery operated. And if we go back in history a little bit, history of drains, suction drains, this attaching a suction to the end of a drain started in 40s and 50s. They used suction pumps, they used wall suction, they actually used good, robust suction. Things worked out. They saw better outcomes in healing time and things like that at that time. Because of that, they started putting suction bulbs, right, at the end of the drains that were portable. Around that time, it seems like the gains kind of became less obvious, right? So 80s is when patients are especially getting discharged home. And these were designed for inpatient use. All of that kind of combines for the situation where we have a device that's much hated. I hope you take a look at what JP drains look like by patients, which leads to misuse. It's very clear that patients are doing all kinds of things. And I'm never going to blame patients for our lack of designing better tools for them to recover at home. And then it doesn't meet the needs of the current modern healthcare system. So healthcare system has some of this where in consumer world, things that you buy at Home Depot or Walmart, they get upgraded very quickly. If something isn't selling, if something isn't working for you, you can speak of it with the dollars you spend. But in this world, the patient isn't spending the dollars directly. There are many decision makers upstream. So this awful device that they have to live with for 3 weeks or so stays the same and doesn't get modernized for 50 years.
Is that the decision of the insurance company or the doctor?
I think everyone together. I wouldn't say one or the other. I think who's going to advocate for the patient who's at home, right? So when you have a surgery, when you come back to the clinic, especially if you're an oncologic patient, right? If you're having a surgery, you're making decisions about life-saving things. Drains are part of the recovery. They are not maybe top on your list, right, at that position. But once you get to the point of having the surgery, having drains 10 days out, that's when you realize these are really bad and I should have. But we're spending more dollars, I think. Telemedicine is coming along, as you know. But as far as devices go, implants, ortho, like things that surgeons use in their OR, variety of tools are getting a lot of attention, medical devices. But helping patients really recover after surgeries at home is an area is not as well understood.
So
right?
I think a follow-up to Jay's question is, who is SOMAVAC selling to? Are you selling to hospitals, to surgeons, to insurance companies? Like who do you target to actually sell your product to?
Short answer is going to be everyone. I mean, and I know as a startup, I have to dissect this. I'm going to be careful to not give out our initial niche market where we'll start everything. But the kind of device we have, so we can be installed, we can be utilized in any environment by a healthcare professional, by a trained healthcare professional. So it falls under a lot of categories. So we fit trauma, we fit orthopedics, we fit, and they can use us in the OR, they can use us in recovery room, they can use us during discharge. There are so many ways that we can be dispensed depending on the state we're in, the geography we're in, the hospital systems, decisions. It's going to take some, as a medtech, early stage medtech, that's our job to figure out which one of those best fits us. But if you ask me generically, there are numerous ways that this can be paid. Certainly, if you think about cosmetic surgery, that's where we apply as well. That's where a patient decides to buy this, or the surgeon uses this in the cost, includes it in the cost of surgery. So I know it's a broad answer, but I want to it's drains are ubiquitous in the healthcare system.
Before we get too far away from talking about the manual bulbs, we spoke with a head of surgery who mentioned that he uses what he called a grenade suction.
That's what we are, yes.
Okay.
Competing with. I mean, not competing, but that's the grenade is the manual suction bulb, yes.
Got it. Okay. And so what is the breakdown now of people who use grenade suction versus the manual bulb?
It's the same thing.
That is the same thing.
Grenade is the same. So in the US, we calculate there are 3 million suction drains used. We calculate. If you assume 2 patients, 1 patient, 1 drain per patient, two drains per patient, 3, it varies. So that's the numbers that, you can think of. But the patients who go home with drains are about 750,000 cases each year in the US. That's how many people we estimate go home at a minimum with drains. We really wanted to design something that really met the needs of the patients who go home specifically, because they have them longer duration. There are issues about communication, and we want to address those. And yes, most of them are these grenades. There are a couple of other devices that are spring-loaded, or in orthopedics, they might use something slightly different. Again, not as effective in suctioning. They are all manual, and they require a strong user interaction for suctioning the bulb. So
you mentioned effective suctioning, and one other thing that we got some insight into was this idea that suctioning has to have a certain amount of like negative energy, or negative suction, or
pressure.
Negative pressure. That's the word.
Yeah.
And it can't be too much because then it'll mess with the tissues, and it can't be too little because then you're not getting all the fluids out. So is there a process within SOMAVAC that kind of does that on a per person basis, or is there a universal, like, here's how much negative pressure you need?
Oh, I appreciate this question, because for sure, if you think about breast tissue mastectomy versus a hernia, abdominal tissue, right? Those are different problems, basically, for negative pressure suction. So what we did is we have a wide range of suction pressures that we can apply or vacuum that we can instill, apply, generate into the tissue. So our first version is basically equivalent to what's out there currently with JP grenades. But when that top line, when they can apply their best pressure, that's what we'll apply. But in orthopedics, they are known to apply higher suction. So we can have very quickly launch another product, which is the same product, but with another pressure setting. Or we can even go lower. And the way our device works is it has technology in it that allows it to turn on and off. So our system comes on and off by itself automatically to adjust the suction level and to maintain it. To maintain the vacuum in the tissue at a given set pressure, which is 100 millimeters of mercury currently. So it's kind of smart. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that probably is why this SOMAVAC is called the SOMAVAC 100, the one that you're going to market with now.
First one, yes. And then we intend to have different versions at different pressure levels.
Why 3 versions versus having one product that has 3 settings?
Ooh, good question. There are elements where when you have a medical device go home with a patient, you don't want them to be able to do anything to it. But you want in the OR as easily for that action to happen with gloves in that theater, right? That's what we call it. Finding the middle ground of that was not something that was straightforward. So we chose to do a skew, and we can presumably do that. We had the switches and everything in there where we could do it. But it's that balance because we don't want alterations of, you don't want to have an antibiotic that the patient says, I'm going to just take a different pill today, something like that.
It seems like simplicity in medical devices is key for patient adherence. And to date, these grenade or traditional bulbs have been like the epitome of simplicity. They look, when you see one, it's like, oh, it does what it does because it does what it does. Your device seems to have some benefits to that. And I'm curious, to me, medical device pricing is just such a black box. So to produce your product seems like, from an outsider's perspective, it would cost more than producing one of these grenades. Is it also going to cost more to the end user? Like, how does pricing work in this setting?
Yes. Let me back off to the term you had, simple. Simple to whom? Right? It was simple to the hospital to buy and sell, simple maybe to nursing staff in an inpatient setting to use because they have biohazard bags, they're trained, patient is not mobile. But it is not at all simple to the patient at home, what that device is. I'm going to walk you through. It is attached to a drain. You might have 2 at a minimum. Most of the time it's 2. How about not at a minimum, but most of the time. Twice a day, you are supposed to not take the bulb off the drain, but open one spout, pour your own bodily fluid into a cup, measuring cup, then write how much you collected in a sheet, and then you're supposed to save that sheet and go to the surgeon at the end of the week and report to him how much. You are drugged up, you have to do math, you have to deal with your own bodily fluids. Imagine pouring your own bodily fluid out of a spout. And what happens is you're supposed to do this twice a day. You're suctioning only then 40 mLs of fluid, and you're supposed to have these so long as there's drainage. So what we hear is phone calls to the clinic. I want my drains out. When can I get it out? We hear, oh yeah, I took the bulb off the drain and went to the bathroom and just poured the fluid out directly. And as soon as you take it off, what happens? The column of fluid that's in the drain goes back into the tissue. So it's simple, but it's really big problem at home. And all of these things I'm describing are opening the chance for what, right? The word that we are all concerned about, infections. All of these misuses are opening the chances for infections. And drain patients are more likely to have SSIs, surgical site infections. That's been documented in papers. There's chicken and egg, whether that's actually due to the drains or whether it's because they are having more complicated surgeries. So it's not simple for anyone downstream of someone having paid very little money for it.
Yeah.
So yes, bulbs are very cheap because they're very simple. But so all of these things I described to you, we add about $1,200, $1,000 to $1,200 cost associated with downstream effects of these bulbs not working as well. That's what we calculate. Clinic visits, coming back to OR for surgery, readmissions, all of these things. When we look at different papers, publications, and we look at incidences in hernia, breast recon, and so on, and work in that world, and then say they came back, let's say 21 patients came back to the clinic, and how much did that cost? Right? We do that math. We get to $1,000 to $1,200 per patient. So, I'm not going to sit here and say that we're going to ask for that for our device. It's going to be somewhere based on our efficacy, right? We've been, FDA approved us or cleared us for having the same efficacy and risk profile as the bulbs. So we will, as we get used, we will see what type of evidence we collect towards reducing seroma incidences, infection rates, time with drains in itself, right? This endpoint that's everyone wants the drains to come out as soon as possible. Those will dictate our price point. But if we expect that new technology costs the same price as what we're replacing, we don't get anything done. I think we have to have a mindset of, are we solving the problem for the continuum of care, right? With this bundled pays and globals and things like that in healthcare. That's what we're at. And that's, I think, the innovation part of our company. Does that make sense? We're thinking for that. When the patient got diagnosed all the way to they're now better.
So you mentioned that the FDA cleared you for having the same efficacy and risk profile as the bulbs. Is that the best outcome you could have hoped for through FDA testing? I'm not familiar.
Yes. So let's make sure that we address this part, as we move forward. We are 510K class 2. We follow the regulations. We fit under that. We are under their umbrella of the risk and efficacy profiles that we had to, provide to them. So yes, we are, we're delivering same pressure level and more reliably. So that's what we proved, right? We proved we're delivering the same pressure level more reliably, and we take off even some of the risks of, one thing we didn't discuss is that we collect in a battery operated way, right, with pumps, but we deposit that fluid into these collection bags that one can then just remove and eliminate without having to interact with their bodily fluids. So we take all of that out of the picture, and we have multiple means of not allowing fluid to go backwards. So we have 2 valves, and the pumps themselves will not allow fluid.
Everything you described sounds like, to me, hearing it, sounds like a superior system to the traditional system. Yeah. What I don't know about FDA testing is if there are levels to say, we definitively know you're more effective than these bulbs, because that sounds like a very compelling sales proposition.
510K process, I'm certainly not a regulatory expert, so that's why we have a regulatory expert that we work with from day one. And, as you were talking about financial field, that's why we consult with them. But there are tiers of class 1 devices, class 2 devices, and further out, each one requires a certain level of evidence and scrutiny, depending on risk and indication, right? Indication, risk. For example, our indication is for all large flat-forming surgeries. So, we are contraindicated, right, for going inside of the body or going near the spine and so on. So those are the kinds of things we get to say we need more data for that indication.
I want to go down this path a bit because you are the first company that we've spoken with that has undertaken the FDA process. What does that look like? Is it an application and an interview? Are you doing clinical trials? Can you just start at the beginning when you came up with this idea and you said, all right, do we need to worry about the FDA? Someone said yes, and then you started. What was that? What did that look like? It's
a regulated space, right? When I make a medical device, or I can't walk anywhere and just start selling it, that's not ethically correct. As an engineer, I have the responsibility to make the safest, best thing I can do, right? Thankfully, we have FDA that oversees that. I think that you hear many really think that they are, there's conversations about they're too difficult or this and that. To me, as an engineer, and I have taught engineers, I've been around engineers, it's good, that we have this check, right? So we started and we knew. So first thing first is we have to decide which class, right? 0 to 510 was an accelerator that only accepted 510K companies, right? So that puts you in a box already. So you work with experts in the field. They provide you their analysis, their thoughts on whether you're class 1 or you're class 2, which category you go in, and what kind of validation, verification efforts you have to go through. What tests, what standards. We have standards like IAC, the global standards, on medical devices for electrical, safety. You have other standards for packaging, for everything. So you follow everything, and you make sure every day, you make sure you wake up, you design, and you follow all of this, that your device is not going to hurt anyone. That's not going to harm someone, and that's going to help them get better. I mean, that's what FDA is after, right?
How long does that process take? Or how long did it take for you?
We are very proud. We started very early, and we were under 2 years for our company, which is, I think it speaks to the team, Josh and Dawn, and, the team that we had, how we clearly identified the risks of our device, understood the regulatory side and compliance side of it. But we've applied, under 2 years from founding. And I think your show highlights companies that are not in East or West Coast, right? I mean, this is the whole thought about, we achieved it under $1 million.
When you first sat down with your lawyers and regulatory consultants, what time frame and budget do they give you? Do they say this is going to be a 3 to 5 year process and you're going to need $5 million? Like where was their guidance, and how did your actual results differ?
So I never did that. I always thought, okay, I said, I'm a professor, associate professor. I have credibility in science and so on, but I'm a fish out of water here. I've not done a company. So I didn't think that the investors were going to bankroll millions of dollars, which is really a medical device company from start to launch is 5 something of those, right? Product launch. It's really, if you went to your big companies and asked them, how much does it take you to design and launch a brand new product successfully, they'll probably give you 5 something more, right? So I knew from get-go that we were going to raise as we go. That was clear to me. So at the end of the we had $50K in our bank, and we were running through it with legal counsels and regulatory, right?
Gotta love those consultants.
Yes, we have the best. We have the best because they have been essential, and we still work with everyone. So I said, what can we achieve with 100K? I mean, those are the numbers we started with. So it built from there. It built from 3-month outlook. So what can we get? What can we get done? So I usually pressured my team into what milestone as a company, as a product development, we get achieved. One of the things that happens unique to medical devices is when you're raising money, which is I learned, you're speculating revenue 3 years out, and the capital you need is really high, and you have to convince everyone around you that you are the team that can do that. So that was challenging, but FDA always was, are you FDA cleared? Was always the main question. So I knew we had to get to that point successfully, reliably, in a good way. So we just we chipped one thing at a time. So, when you get a report from a compliance expert, you get bullet points of you need this done, you need this done for your application. Each one carries X dollars of development, de-risking, and testing and validation. Third parties come in. So you just chip away at those. Each one I priced, and some of them we kicked off earlier, some of them later. And, once you finish all of those up, and each time you complete something successfully, I think investors see the track record of you having said you're going to do something and it gets done. That builds trust and relationship with angels in your, community. So
I have a question about the company. You mentioned earlier this vision that you had. And Ross Baird, who is a venture capitalist with Village Capital, came on and asked a question of an early stage company that I think is kind of applicable here. And it's this idea of, are you building a product or are you building a company? And I'm curious your thoughts on SOMAVAC. Are you building a product, which is great and like is going to solve a lot of issues for people, or are you building a company that's bigger than this product?
I think we're also, I would like to add something else. Are we building a thought in healthcare? I just want to throw that out as well, and an avenue to think differently. If you ask me this, maybe even 8 months ago, I would say we're building more of a product or a series of products, a platform possibly. But now I think we're more after a company because we really realize that we need to think differently when we think of patients who have surgeries who then go home to recover. So in the world of chronic diseases, there are solutions. You hear insulin pumps and all kinds of things, DME. You hear patients who stay in the hospital to recover. There's all kinds of medical devices for them. Who is watching out for the patients who just got discharged and have to get home and recover? So we feel like we have an opportunity here. Little did we know, we didn't understand the scope of everything, but now that we're here, we're understanding that process of bridging the two sides of home or outside of hospital, not just home, to in hospital. We can do that where we can understand the upstream and downstream problems and be the bridge between in a constructive way versus blaming each side, right? So, but the reality, there's a certain level of reality in medical devices. I started mostly the way the company really launched. One thing didn't come out yet is we decided to do this, but hernia surgeons told us something. But then when I was telling a couple of, like my neighbor, I'm getting out of academia, I'm working on a product that's going to be about drains. She says, I had drains, 6 drains. And when you hear the stories, that's what made us get, oh gosh, we have to do something. This can't be it. So both Josh, my co-founder, and myself are extremely driven to find ways to reach as many patients as we can. Meaning, we all want cancer not to be here. We all want best research to take place that we can diagnose and eliminate this big problem that affects so many people. But in the meantime, we can do things that really impact patients right now, right? And we can do that in 2 to 3 years development processes like we went through. So that's our whole mindset, that what are the things we can do now without 10, 20 year out kind of research and development that's known to happen in medtech, right? What are things we can kind of launch quickly? We know with our platform, we have possibilities to do orthopedic, trauma, so many different things with it. We want to grow that out. But I was, I guess, touching to your question back, I feel as though still distribution, national distribution, global distribution is best in the hands of established companies who can do that much better than us. So at some point that will come up. We want to grow a company with multiple products and lines. But at some point, I think having our device accessible to as many people is best done in the hands of, big players in this area.
So for you to go through this whole FDA process, you mentioned you're coming up with projections for revenue 3+ years out. What does the opportunity look like for SOMAVAC? How big is the market opportunity, and what were these numbers you were telling investors? Like, well, if all goes well and we get the certification, we could get to this level of revenue.
Yes. First of all, first year for medtech, launches and so on, $1 million, $500K to $1 million. Those are good numbers, right? The market is, if you think about it, I think the global drain market, finally someone did look at a drain market. Last thing I saw was 4.8 billion is what I recall. I may have to double check that. And it's growing. It's growing very fast. And then in the US, it's $1 billion plus market, depending on that, what we can recover on the way of evidence and building and solve problems. It was a complicated way of describing at the beginning, because are we going to price it based on what we are going to prevent from happening, based on sheer numbers of cases? As I shared with you, there are 3 million drains used in the US. So 1.5 million of these possibly are needed, right? And there are 750,000 patients who go home with the drains. And that's the market that we're targeting. So this is, again, in the startup world, right? When we hear pitches and everything, people are talking about revenues. In medical devices, I was advised not to give them revenue projections. Don't, because you're 2-3 years out, right? So it's really very speculative. So I was, as an engineer, very uncomfortable speculating 3 years out and so on. But we know how big the market is. And with our additional thoughts on what we're going to do with this, we know that we can get to multi-million-dollar revenue out a few years.
It's an interesting dichotomy to me that revenue is so speculative in medical devices, and yet the trend is higher investment in medical devices. So it must be a pretty big hit when it does hit.
Yes. So I think that there are multiple types of investors in this world, and the ones who do medtech know it that how many cases a year, how many patients need this, and who are the payers. The question you asked about comparison of the prices, current technology, is there reimbursement? So most of the medtech investors' revenue projections are almost, if you show revenue projections, you might realize that they know you're a newbie almost, so it goes both ways. I think you say, with my effort, I know on the first year, but this is now 2 years ago, this was even challenging because what sales channels we're going to use, we haven't decided at that point. But I know this year I can do this with this information, with these assumptions. But in 5 years, I know the potential of the market is this. I think then you kind of marry the two, right? But really, that always has been a challenge because as medtech companies, we pitch or we're in the same crowd with everyone, right? And we can't do A/B testing. We can't do some of these things that people look for, for traction. What is traction for medtech? It's very complicated.
How did you, as somebody who hadn't been an entrepreneur before, how did you navigate fundraising yourself? That had to have been new for you.
It was yes and no, right? As an academic, I don't know if you know what we do, but as an engineering prof, in academia, one of the things I spent most of my time doing is writing grants. And I used to show my students how many grants I wrote and how many actually I got in. And it's 1 in 10, or 1 in 10 is actually good odds. They say when funding is, 1 in 10 is, I'll take that. But so that part I understood, how you get funding. The part that was really challenging was being in front of people to ask for that money. But what I very quickly appreciated was if someone didn't like what you were presenting, you could see it in their face and you moved on. With grant writing, it's a 6-month process to a year process, and you get a piece of paper that says your grant wasn't good, and it's just a piece of paper. At least I want to see and ask, why didn't you like it? Explain it further. So that part was excellent. But at the same time, I struggled with pitch events and 3 minutes and 5-minute type things because medtech, I got to explain to you a lot of things. Let's sit down and talk for a couple of hours. And we are so speculative. I don't want to put things on my slides that are really attractive, but very speculative. I was very caught up in that as far as I don't feel comfortable telling them that this is exactly what's going to happen 2 years from now. I didn't want to lie. I didn't want to make things up. So,
one more question for me to wrap things up here. You originally had planned to go to Ohio State. You landed at Tennessee Tech. Now you're starting this company in Tennessee. What has being in Tennessee or even Memphis specifically meant for your company? And does it seem like the right place for a medical device company?
The last one is yes. We have Smith & Nephew, Medtronic, Olympus, Wright Medical, Microport, you name it. St. Jude is here. UT Medical School is here. We are, I think, second highest employment. Again, don't quote me on this. After Warsaw, Indiana, medtech like this. There's a lot of talent in this town that knows medtech and, devices. 2, there's FedEx. We are rich in, logistics and things like that. My husband is from Tennessee. I arrived here, we met, married. So this is a natural place for me to be in, But I'll tell you, the thing that I want to discuss maybe here is that I was probably one of the oldest people in the accelerator, right? I mean, you know what I mean. The accelerators, everything entrepreneurship these days is geared towards younger people like yourselves, you know, not for mid-career people like me. Maybe rightfully so. I don't know why, but it's more geared towards attracting younger people into choosing a career in entrepreneurship. But in Memphis, what you have is if you have two incomes and one wants to take risk, you can afford possibly. So if I were in Boston or San Francisco, I doubt my husband would have said, okay, you quit your job, go do what you want to do. I doubt that would have been a possibility. So what I'm trying to say is when we have like what I told some of my colleagues here in Memphis, you may want to target these companies who have people who have worked in them mid 40s or so to jump ship and start companies. And they can do it in Memphis because they can afford it. Your savings go farther. Things are affordable. If I told you my rent to my office here, Columbus, you're in Columbus. We agree on this, but I would say that it allows for risk taking for mid-career professionals as well. So that's why I find very lucky to be here.
I'm curious, sorry, one follow-up question on that. Age isn't really something we've examined much on the podcast. We've heard venture capitalists and community builders say, hey, in our city, we have more of an older skewed age or a younger skewed age of who's starting companies. I'm curious more on the social side of things. I know that if I went and told my network of friends that I'm starting a company and we're going to an accelerator, the response would be, that's really cool. That's really awesome. Like, that's something to strive for. Like, good for you. At your age demographic, what was the response like? And do you think that maybe that has some sort of hindrance to more people kind of jumping on if that response is more, you're kind of crazy versus that's awesome?
Yeah. So first of all, my age group probably doesn't know what an accelerator is or an incubator is, right? I mean, no, so most of them, when I told them, they didn't get what it is, right? So, but the other thing is my husband has only been super supportive. But when I told him I think I'm co-founding a company, he's like, no, don't do it. That was his first gut reaction to it because of a variety of things, I think, because all the unknowns that it brings. But my personality is that I just love the unknowns and I'm just always up for a challenge. Yes. I mean, when I told them all summer long, I was attending this thing downtown with all the young people, all this, they're probably looking at me, what's she doing? And I think now maybe people are coming around to realize, wow, that's kind of, the thing to do. But I also would say maybe I am different because I really jumped ship and did something different. If you're in real estate and you choose to do a company in real estate, you may not need an accelerator. You may need the funding, the 50Ks, the small amounts of dollars to get you moving. So we have examples of that in Memphis, right? We have a lot of these very successful medical device companies, mid-career managers or VPs, or they kind of either decide to leave or let go or whatever, and they just start something on their own. And we have those as well. Actually, we have quite a few small medical device successful startups here that have paved the way. I just knew I didn't know anything about how to do a business. I knew in academia we didn't learn some of the things like you have professional careers. Did you know that in academia we get no professional training? Like,
No.
How when you get into a company, you get diversity training, this training, how to talk to people, how to present, this and that. We don't. There's not that ancillary things so I knew I had a lot of catch up to do if I were. And accelerators play networking role. They put you in front of people.
This has been awesome, Esra. We've gone even a little bit longer than we typically go, so thank you for sharing so much with us. If listeners want to learn more about you or SOMAVAC after the show, where should they go?
They can go to our website, SOMAVAC Medical Solutions, at www.somavac.com. That's with an A, SOMAVAC. They can email me at Esra with an S, ESRA, at somavac.com. We really want to make big noise with those who know how awful drains were. Please go to our website, go to our Facebook page, share us and let everyone know that someone is working on this problem. We really need your help in getting the word out.
All right, Eric, we just spoke with Esra Roan, the co-founder and CEO of SOMAVAC. Let's get into this. Let's talk about the opportunity. Let's talk about Esra as a founder. Where do you want to start this week?
Yeah, let's definitely start with the founder side of things. I think that Esra has one of the more interesting, diverse backgrounds that we've had on the show for sure. Probably the first person I've ever actually met from Istanbul.
Interesting, because you're making a big deal about how ancient and historical and center of the world Istanbul is. And the first person you met.
First person I met. I love history. And that city just always is in the middle of every history you study. For one reason or another, it's around and it's old and it's geographically located in a place that's very important in between Asia and Europe for trade, for religion, for everything. So the city itself is just always around under a different name, under a different ruler, whatever. But I've never met anyone from there.
Istanbul, not Constantinople now. Istanbul, not Constantinople now.
Is that a song?
Long. Yeah, you don't know that song?
Uh-uh.
Who sings that song? It's a real silly band.
No idea.
They Might Be Giants. The song Istanbul, in parentheses, not Constantinople.
Well,
you got to listen to it. It's all I was thinking about when you're talking about Istanbul, and you even mentioned Constantinople. And
right,
I was like,
and Byzantium.
Long time ago. What I liked about this conversation with Esra and her background in particular, this was the best antithetical view to academics as entrepreneurs that I've ever gotten.
I would agree. We talked about on the WUBO episode how I have a general bias against academics as entrepreneurs. Not that I don't think they can be good entrepreneurs. It's just my natural inclination is to first say, you're an academic, going to be hard to be an entrepreneur. What about Esra kind of bucked that trend for you?
She talked about problem solving, and she did mention a caveat that I think is probably true, being that her academic background is in engineering specifically, which probably lends itself well to entrepreneurship. I also really appreciated her answer about fundraising, because she said, as an academic, you do so much research, you're constantly applying for grants, and in the grant world, you don't get the feedback that she was getting as an entrepreneur. She says, as an entrepreneur, when you're fundraising, if people don't like what you're saying, you can see it on their face and you can ask them why. Where with a grant, you just get a rejection. Really interesting parallel I've never drawn before.
Yeah, I've never even thought about that, to be honest. But it makes a lot of sense. You need funding in both spaces, and there's just a different way to go about it.
One more thing I wanted to touch on that was surprising to me about this interview. Esra kept speaking to her curiosity and her creativity. And I asked, was entrepreneurship a through line or part of your family? And she said no. And normally you see people who have that curiosity or creativity, they're dabbling in something when they're younger, whether it's a lemonade stand, whether it's, buying candy bars and selling to their peers at school. But that wasn't her case. This is her first go at it. It just felt familiar and like something she could take on.
That could be a cultural thing as well. She kind of hinted at the differences growing up versus being in the United States and the opportunities that are in front of you and the ability to maybe take risk by being in a culture that accepts risk, but also by living in a city where you can mitigate risk by having two incomes and then just living off one of them.
Yeah. When she was talking about her husband and their relationship and his support, but also at times trepidance, I thought that was very, very personal and vulnerable for her to share, but probably something that a lot of entrepreneurs who are married experience.
Talk to me about this opportunity. Let's just kind of transition into how big can this thing get? Because one thing that Esra talked about was the idea that this started as a product and is now becoming a company. What does that mean to you for the opportunity size? Does it mean anything for the opportunity size? Do you still evaluate the company based on a product, or do you think about the company as potentially being more than that?
At this point, it's definitely a product. I think potentially it could be something more than that, although the brand SOMAVAC is pretty specific towards, what feels like suction with vac for vacuum. But they could branch into other products. The really interesting dichotomy that she shared with us was the decision to have multiple products for different strengths of suction instead of having one with varying strengths, which I think is very indicative of their go-to-market strategy, or, how they're interacting with users, who their customers are. Because she mentioned if it was going to be within the medical environment, the medical professionals could handle the setting it to the specific or the particular type of suction they need, whereas the individual who has it in their home needs something that is kind of dummy proof. I think that introduces some complexities or maybe some additional overhead that wouldn't be there otherwise. But my biggest question in terms of the opportunity outstanding is still kind of who's the core customer and what is the revenue model with that core customer? Is it insurance? Is it the medical offices? Is it the end user? What did you think?
That was my biggest question leaving the interview as well. I think I specifically asked the question, who is SOMAVAC selling to? Is it the healthcare professional? Is it the hospital? Is it the individual? Where am I buying this? Who's buying it? How are they buying it? And I didn't get the clearest answer there. My gut, after going through the interview, tells me that it's going to be sold to hospital divisions who kind of upsell it to their patients to take home. But I could be completely wrong there. I just don't have a firm grasp of where. I don't think I'm going to see this device in CVS, for example.
Yeah, it seems like insurance has to be involved here, but this is why I was asking some of the questions about the FDA level of clearance. She said that it was cleared as having the same efficacy and risk profile as the bulbs. Bulbs are a lot cheaper. So if I'm the insurance company and I'm saying this has the same efficacy as the bulbs, I'm going to keep recommending the bulbs because it's cheaper. But if they can prove higher efficacy, and that's lower cost of readmittance, lower cost of additional surgeries that the insurance has to pay for, they're probably going to mandate a SOMAVAC, which is what they would want. But I'm guessing then that the insurance company or the hospital is paying for that. I can't think it's, I don't know. I don't know what the price point is. We didn't get a discussion on price points. I don't even know if it's viable for the end customer to be buying this at a CVS if it did go to retail. From my brief experience in healthcare, I know that more often than you would expect and probably hope, the insurance company is making decisions on the type of care that is being administered based on costs. Like if you broke your arm and you went to the emergency room or wherever, it's entirely likely that the doctor will say, let's put a hard cast on this. And then your insurance company will say, nope, do a soft cast for basis of cost. So I don't know. It's a complex system that I just don't know a whole lot more than that, or what levels of authority doctors have versus insurance versus the customer saying or the user saying, nope, I want the hard cast. Nope, I want the SOMAVAC. But it seems like it's not really in the customer's hand if it's being paid for by the insurance company.
Well, that might get into pricing then, because Esra mentioned that there is $1,000 to $1,200 of cost per user associated with bulbs not working. So if they can find a price point that appeases the insurance company by mitigating their eventual costs for potential complications, then I think that that's a winning proposition. So our price point is not going to be the full burden of that cost.
And she mentioned that 750,000 patients go home with drains. So if the insurance company or whoever's making the decision says, we're going SOMAVAC instead of bulbs, that's a lot of devices annually to patients who would much prefer the experience of a SOMAVAC from what it sounds like. And that sounds like it could be a pretty big market. She mentioned that the drain market is $4.8 billion in the U.S. Nope, sorry, that's globally. $1 billion in the U.S.
Right, and they're likely increasing a price point, which is something we actually don't hear about much here on Upside. We usually hear, hey, here's the total addressable market, but we're coming in at 25% of the price. So we always have this question about, okay, is that the actual market then? Is that the total addressable market? But here, the market is actually potentially going to grow dependent on how wide SOMAVAC can kind of reach and how much higher their price point is. So that's a very interesting proposition that I don't think we've seen before.
Yeah, but it's warranted when you have what appears to be and is positioned as a superior premium product that is more efficacious, which you can't claim it to be more efficacious, but I'm going to claim that if what she's saying is true, it's more efficacious than bulbs because, as we heard from Dr. Gay, being able to have continuous suction is valuable. Also, not having the user experience of pulling out fluid from yourself is valuable, and keeping those layers of tissue together expedites the healing process. So I think it's warranted to raise the cost in that situation, especially if the downstream complications cost, as you pointed out, is lower to the end payer.
Right. It sounds like there's still some tests to be run there, so I don't know if the J. Klaus stamp of approval is going to get them over their hurdle, but it sounds like there needs to be some more testing done to get some more results that can be so that claims can be made.
Talking to Esra and her team as founders, they took what is a pretty burdensome from a cost and time and effort standpoint process and cleared this Class 2 certification with the FDA in under 2 years and for under $1 million, which she ballparked could typically be $5 million or more, which, classic Midwestern entrepreneur being capital efficient and finding a way.
You got to love that. And doing it likely faster as well.
Yep. So, Eric, I don't know if there's a whole lot more to discuss here. Oh, actually, you know what I do want to discuss? I want to touch on Memphis for Esra. Because as we spoke with Katie Milligan in our previous episode of StartCo on Memphis, she recommended that we speak with Esra, actually. She fits into some of the themes that we talked about with Memphis. She went through one of the accelerators locally that helped them get to this level of FDA approval. That was something Katie mentioned. And also, she felt like despite her path to Memphis being kind of by chance, it was a specifically good place for her to start this company as a medical device company. So now we have a perspective of both a community builder and an entrepreneur in Memphis. Too early to say that Memphis is a burgeoning startup hub, but it's cool to get that perspective from two viewpoints now.
Absolutely. And just one last thing about SOMAVAC before we dive into our final questions. I think that we started this conversation off with the idea of being an academic and transitioning into entrepreneur. And I think we saw kind of an evolution in Esra's thinking as well that, okay, I'm an academic. Okay, I can go build this product. It sounds interesting. It sounds like from an engineer's perspective, she thinks of engineering as an art form, which I think is like really cool. But she was essentially solving this small puzzle. And then I think we heard as the interview kind of extended a bit, we started talking about the opportunity, that big vision kind of start popping up a little bit. Not to the point where it was like well-formed or anything, and it doesn't have to be. But she said, we want to be a thought avenue for a way to think differently about patients at home and out of the hospital, which sounds to me more like a vision for a company than a product. And I think that trickle is starting to happen. It's, okay, we're creating a product now, but I'm starting to think a little bit bigger about this. And I think back to our interview with Ross Baird when he talked about this idea that has stuck with me. He said a lot of companies will start as a product and can become a company. And there's nothing wrong with being a product. And I feel that way about this company right now, is that they are a product, but there's this like vision that's emerging.
Another thing that Esra mentioned was that she seemed open to the idea of working as a partnership or as a exit strategy with a company that has wider distribution relationships already. I think in the medical device field, and I'm sure it's true of other industries too, but particularly right now I'm thinking about medical devices. If I'm an investor, I'm less concerned about the company versus product route, because if I think this is going to be successful, it seems very clear to me what type of exit opportunity exists in medical devices, which as an investor, I'm looking for a liquidation event, and an exit opportunity is one of the prime examples, probably much more likely than an IPO. So I'm interested in it, whether it's a company or a product. What you're talking about, this mission of changing how we think about out of hospital care for patients, I think that could be the basis of a company, but I don't know if I'm investing on that vision so much as saying like, I can see where this can be acquired pretty quickly.
Fair. So Jay, what are you looking for in the next 6 to 18 months from Esra and SOMAVAC?
Classic me. I'm looking to see how they're doing in terms of traction getting into hospitals, and revenue would be great. I don't recall the time frame she talked about going to market, but I think she did say in their FDA application they were projecting $500,000 to $1 million in the first year. I don't know if they're in that first year in the next 6 to 18 months or not, but I do want to see. I want to know that they know who their customer is, who's paying for it, and what type of reception they're getting from that market.
And on my side, I want to hear more about, I want to get some numbers. I want to get some trials. I want to get some testing. I want to get some numbers that we can talk about that say, okay, it's this much better, not it's as good or better. Like the vague nature of the FDA approval process, I would like to just know a little bit more about, okay, patients use this, even if it's something like patients use this and they liked it 100 times more than bulbs, like patients who've used both. Like just something that can give me more comparison between the two. Because if bulbs were created in the 40s and 50s and they really peaked in like the 80s, and they really haven't changed in the last 40 years, then I have to believe there's the potential for a big change by thinking about this differently. And that big change needs to be captured in some sort of metric. And right now, I just don't have that.
All right, guys, we'd love to hear your thoughts on SOMAVAC. You can tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm. And if you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend. After you send it to a friend, rate this episode in this podcast on iTunes. Your ratings and your support go a long way in bringing on high-quality guests to the show. We'll talk to you next week. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's guest, so shoot us an email at hello@upside.fm or find us on Twitter @UpsideFM. We'll be back here next week at the same time talking to another founder in our quest to find upside outside of Silicon Valley. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please email us or find us on Twitter and let us know. And if you love our show, please leave us a review on iTunes. That goes a long way in helping us spread the word and continue to help bring high-quality guests to the show. Eric and I decided there were a couple things we wanted to share with you at the end of the podcast, and so here we go. Eric Hornung and Jay Klaus are the founding parties of the Upside podcast. At the time of this recording, we do not own equity or other financial interest in the companies which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinions of Duff & Phelps LLC and its affiliates, Unreal Collective LLC and its affiliates, or any entity which employ us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We have not considered your specific financial situation nor provided any investment advice on this show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Never mind, bro, that can't be matched. I'm lighting it on fire, used to run victory laps, and still I'm not even tired. It's all about the timing, yeah, that's what they say. Well, I'ma keep on rhyming.